Hi. Just very briefly, Ron's not a deacon. He wished he was a deacon, but he's really not a deacon. Unfortunately, he did go to Notre Dame and Emory and all that. And we have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to tell you what your job is. Your job is to listen. Our job is to talk. And we hope you don't stop before we do. If you like what you've seen, come and talk to me. If you don't, see Pat Chivers. She supervised me for 4 years. This is a model program. You should really take pride in that you are a part of this thing. This is exactly what Archbishop Gregory is trying to accomplish throughout the diocese, with his emphasis on family, with his emphasis on dynamic adult presentations. I'm gonna take this home with me and get with the Archbishop and say, get out there and see what they got. I know it's what you want. Anyway, we have a PowerPoint. Ron and I are both very active on death row. Ron will present some of his experiences within the context of the PowerPoint. If we have enough time, I'll spend some time with you and give you some experiences that I've had. I've actually witnessed some executions. I provided spiritual direction for several of those who are now in heaven. And I am very intimately involved in the death penalty. But let's get going with the PowerPoint, and I'll be around making sure you're paying attention.
Thank you, Dick.
Thank you. There we go. Am I on? This is more people than we usually talk to, and to say the least. I mean, we've had sometimes when we were the majority, but I am delighted to be here and to present this PowerPoint that we developed through a task force on the death penalty in the Archdiocese. I have a visual aid besides the PowerPoint. This is my security blanket here, This security blanket figures in the presentation, so I'm going to put it over the podium here, and I'll talk to you about why I brought it when we get to that point in the presentation. We're talking about how Catholics see the death penalty, and we're going to end by talking about what we Catholics can do to end the death penalty in the state of Georgia. The death penalty has a long and terrible history. We keep trying to make it better. You know, we try improved ways of killing people, and you recognize some of these different ways. We're right now at this one. Deacon Dick has witnessed this, has witnessed a death like this. Person dying looking like they're affixed to a cross. And we know that the most famous execution in all of history was the execution we observed on Good Friday, when our Lord died for us. And it's for that reason that we Christians are especially concerned about the use of the death penalty today. The death penalty today is going out of fashion worldwide. Most countries in the world have officially abolished the death penalty. 18 of our 50 states have abolished the death penalty, but it's still around. The most prominent places in the world to use the death penalty are an unsavory group of countries leading up to us. China, Iran, North Korea, Yemen, sort of Yemen and Saudi Arabia is how they usually put them together. And fifth in the world, the United States. In our country, over 3,000 people sit on death row awaiting execution. In the state of Georgia, we were up over 100. We've whittled the number down. Some of them we whittled down by killing them. We've got about 80 people now on death row, including one woman awaiting execution. Archbishop Gregory offered some thoughts to the Catholics of North Georgia about our responsibility to address the death penalty, and we'd like to play what he has to say here in this video.
Pictures
and brothers in Christ. As Catholics, we are people of life. We are called to proclaim that human life is sacred as we work to defend the dignity of all human persons. We believe that every person is precious in God's eyes, and we strive to be a voice for those who are forgotten or neglected. My message today is a challenge for Catholics to speak out against the use of capital punishment. We live in a society that continues to progress and provides other means to safely protect its citizens from those who are incarcerated. The death penalty is not necessary in the United States. Georgia is one of only 34 states in the United States that continues to execute people rather than choose alternative sentencing, including life imprisonment without parole. My challenge to you is similar to those that were made by my immediate predecessor, Archbishop John Donahue, and by his predecessor, Archbishop James Lake. Archbishop Lake drew on a tragic personal experience. His own brother had been a victim of murder, and the killers faced a possible death sentence. But at his brother's funeral, the Archbishop recalled that our Blessed Lord himself was sentenced to death on a cross and had died forgiving his killers. And so the Lake family also called for mercy and forgiveness, even for those who had not confronted it personally. This is a very serious issue. It is one on which the thinking of the Church has evolved, partly in response to changing social circumstances, and also in response to prayerful reflection on the message of the gospel. I ask each of you to prayerfully reflect on your own views on capital punishment in light of the gospel and of Catholic teaching. Let us work together to help build a culture of life in our state and in our nation. The cycle of violence against human life diminishes all of us. Thank you, and God bless you.
As soon as we tell people that ours is a church that opposes capital punishment, and especially when we tell people here in the part of the country where executions are most frequent, in the Bible Belt, people have a response. And the response is to quote the Bible at us. Say, wait a minute, you're against capital punishment? Doesn't the Bible say what? And a tooth for a tooth. Eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. I have had this quoted at me from pickup trucks. Riding by the Capitol when we were out praying for people at an execution, and people come by on the baseball game and they go, eye for an eye, like that. And you know, oh boy, they hope they don't throw anything at you. And in fact, this is in the Bible. It is 3 times in the law of Moses. And it may be that sometimes we say, well, they were trying to qualify, the possible punishment that awaited someone who did wrong. Don't do anything worse than this. Somebody takes your eye, don't kill them. But in fact, it's an endorsement of vengeance. 3 times in the Old Testament that occurs. And one more time in the Bible, somebody else in the Bible said, an eye for an eye. Who said it? Jesus. Jesus said it. Jesus put it in a different context. Jesus said, you heard it said, an eye for an eye. But I tell you something different. This was the Sermon on the Mount. I tell you no vengeance. This is the whole part about go the extra mile. turn the other cheek. Love your enemies and forgive those who do you wrong. Be like God, who lets the sun shine and the rain fall on good and bad alike. That is a mighty hard teaching. That's the hardest teaching of all. That's the one we have most trouble with. And when you think of it in terms of a public issue like the death penalty, you say, well, gee, how could we possibly live up to such a lofty ideal? The church has afforded us guidance in how to think this through. The church says what this is all about is human dignity. The dignity of the inviolable dignity of the human person. Our opposition to the death penalty is part of our opposition to violence generally. It's part of our consistent life ethic. Womb to tomb, conception to natural death, where we respect the dignity of every human life. Human dignity, we believe, is inviolable. Inviolable. I bet the kids all know what inviolable means. I'm tempted to ask, but anybody know what does inviolable mean? You can't violate. You can't. You shouldn't. You mustn't. You can't take it away. It's inherent in us as children made in the image of God, as redeemed by Jesus Christ. Our dignity is inviolable. Nobody can lose their human dignity, not even a murderer. In the Gospel of Life, Evangelium Vitae, his encyclical that was primarily about abortion, St. John Paul talked about the dignity of people on death row. And he said, quoting St. Ambrose, way back in the 4th century, he said, notice how at the very first murder in the Bible, which was the murder of Abel by Cain, by his brother Cain, God confronted Cain and put a mark on Cain. And the mark was for what? So nobody else would kill him. Cain said, if I go forth to God... Of course, the Bible stories are not strictly literal, because obviously, if you're thinking about Cain and Abel as the children of Adam, there wouldn't have been anybody else to kill him. But Cain says to God, I'm worried. I go forth in the world, somebody will kill me for what I've done, because I deserve it. And God says, I'll put a mark on you. St. Ambrose said, God did not desire, even at the first murder, that a homicide be revenged with another homicide. John Paul says, and we today can do at least as well. And that's when the church first affirmed its strong opposition to the death penalty. But people say, well, wait, without the death penalty, how can we protect the innocent? This is an issue with which the church historically has wrestled. The church came into its own in Europe at the very time that the Western Roman Empire was falling apart. The barbarians were literally at the gates. Constantine had recognized the church, and his successors had endorsed the church. Everybody was signing up to be a Catholic. And the church people confronted a real serious problem. What are we going to do about these barbarians who are trying to kill us? And for the first time in Christian history, churchmen began to think, well, if there's no other way to stop people from hurting the innocent, then we may have to inflict violence on them and even take their lives. And we use that to justify not only retaliation in war, but also capital punishment. Over the years, that sort of morphed into justifying all kinds of executions. By the Victorian times, we were executing people for pickpocketing. We were executing children for pickpocketing. And we were justifying it. John Paul called us back and said, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Today, we don't have to stop people from hurting the innocent by killing them. we have non-lethal alternatives that we can use. In the United States, every state except one allows a sentence of life in prison without parole, without the possibility of parole, for people who are too dangerous ever to be on the streets again, people who would otherwise possibly hurt people. A non-lethal alternative. Now, people look at that, though, and they say, well, even if you lock somebody else up in a cage for a good part of their life, you got to deal with, they took a life and they still have theirs. Is that really fair? Pope Benedict addressed that question not long before he stepped down as Holy Father. He said, not only is that just and fair, it is exactly the kind of justice God uses when he deals with us. Benedict said, for us, we tend to think of justice and mercy as two different things. We think of justice as we're going to give you what you got coming. And we tend to think of mercy as we'll pull back a little bit. Maybe we won't do that. But Benedict said that's not how it works for God. For God, he said, justice and charity coincide. Every just act of God is also a merciful act. And every merciful act of God, because he is God and sets the standard, is an act of justice. And if we are to be godly people, we must recognize this coincidence of justice and mercy. This is, of course, the theme of Pope Francis. Mercy. That's the theme of his papacy. Not only is this fair to show mercy, but it's the kind of justice that we call restorative justice, when we forgive and bring people even back into the community. It's a kind of justice that brings healing. It brings healing to the victims of a murder. Some of you saw recently in this trial that's going on in Boston, the parents of this little boy who was, we saw his first communion picture when he was killed. Martin Richard, his name was, killed in that terrible bombing. His parents said, we do not want the guy who planted that bomb executed. What will bring us healing is just stick him in prison and we'll be done with it. We'll have closure. That's what they wanted. We don't want vengeance, because vengeance doesn't bring healing. It doesn't bring healing to victims, and it doesn't bring healing to society. We heal society that's racked by vengeance when we forgive, when we show mercy, because we end the cycle of violence. That's why Pope Francis has told us. And you actually have an article on your tables where Deacon Dick put articles out, printed out these articles, where Pope Francis talked about his thoughts on the death penalty and on justice. And he says, we need to rethink the whole criminal justice system completely. We need not only to abolish the death penalty, insofar as we can, we need to improve prison conditions so that people are not treated like animals when they're in prison, because they're not animals. They have human dignity. We need to abolish all of these life sentences that aren't intended to protect us from people who could harm us, but are simply punitive, are vengeful. We need to look at reincorporating people into society. And he says we need to end even the trigger happiness on the part of the world's police, who sometimes execute people that they want off the streets. And some people say they see that even happening here in the United States. The church it correctly teaches, and still teaches, that if there were no other way to stop a person from hurting the innocent, that it would be justifiable to end their life. The church does teach that, and it's in the Catechism. But the church also teaches, as Pope Francis said, that it simply isn't necessary anywhere in the world to do that anymore. And that, in fact, the gospel is calling us to do better than that. I think I've accurately represented that, and you can read the words of Pope Francis on it in the article that Deacon Dick provided. The bottom line of all this, though, it's a hard line to swallow when you read about horrible crimes, like the crime in Boston and other crimes where people are innocent people, totally innocent people, are killed just wantonly. But the very worst killer is a human being like me and you. And that's really sometimes very hard for us to accept. I had an experience of it, a personal experience of it, that I want to share with you here at the end of this presentation. I was for many years a visitor on death row to a young man that I used to say to him, "You are the least sympathetic character on Georgia's death row." The typical person on death row in Georgia has had a terrible, terrible life, and had a terrible life long before he committed any crimes. Some people, you wonder why they didn't kill more people than they did when you hear about what happened to them as children. Poverty, violence, abuse, all kinds of things they confronted. This young man was quite different. He came from a very nice middle-class family from the suburbs of Atlanta. Grew up in East Cobb. His parents were very well educated. His father was a nuclear engineer. His mom was a college graduate, so she stayed at home with the kids, the 3 kids. The family were very devoutly religious, very involved in their church, and instilled their faith in their children. Taught them a strong work ethic. Seemed like everything was going right. In fact, they'd gone to church, the whole family, the night before this happened. Then this clip explains then what Andrew DeYoung did that brought him onto death row. Can we see the video, please?
Accused of murdering his parents and sister, 20-year-old Andy DeYoung has been waiting almost 2 years for his trial. The bodies of DeYoung's parents in their bedroom, DeYoung's 14-year-old sister Sarah in the upstairs hallway, her body mutilated with multiple stab wounds. Cheryl Ann Davis was the first officer to go into the house. She testified earlier at a preliminary hearing.
The bed was all messed up. There were large blood splatters on the bed, large droplets. There was also a pile of clothing on the floor with blood across the room on it. They were laying at the foot of the bed on the floor in a position that wouldn't have been comfortable to lie in. It appeared that there was some moving about.
Also expected to testify in DeYoung's murder trial is this man, 25-year-old David Haggerty. Haggerty already has pleaded guilty to going to DeYoung's home with him the night of the murders. Haggerty told me by phone from his jail cell that he pleaded guilty in exchange for only 1 life sentence.
Even though I did not actually commit the murders, in the eyes of the jury, I was just guilty because I was present.
Haggerty says DeYoung told him they were going to the home to kill DeYoung's family.
At this juncture, he had informed me that I was to help him, or that myself and or my family would die in the process.
DeYoung's attorney, Dennis O'Brien, says he will attack the veracity of Haggerty. He says he believes that Haggerty has concocted a story to save his own skin, that his client is innocent. Jury selection expected to take about a week. We're live in Cobb County. Don McClellan, Channel 2, Action News.
The other guy who was in the house that night was not lying. Andrew DeYoung killed 3 of his family members. He would have killed his mom and his dad and his younger sister. He would have killed his younger brother also if the younger brother had not jumped out a window. I'd like to say that it was intentional discipleship that led me to death row, but actually it was almost an accident. I was asked to edit a manuscript for another inmate, and when I went to do that, I was asked if I would talk to Andrew DeYoung because I was a college professor and Andrew was very smart. And this other inmate said he'd just come to death row and I think he's going to have a hard time if he doesn't have somebody to see him or visit him. And that's how I happened to get involved with him. And over the years that we visited him, which is about 13, 14 years, me and my family came very close to us, and I came to understand and see beyond this crime, which is a horrible crime, to Andrew DeYoung as a person. And I learned that he was a child genius, but a child genius who was very, very troubled from very early. Here's a little picture of him when he was a couple years old, in his little sailor suit with a frown on his face. He didn't relate to people. He didn't bond. You know, I don't understand all the things about the autism spectrum, and I don't think anybody does, but something was going on there where he had great powers of mind and no ability of heart. No ability to bond to other people. He was a kid who, when he was in high school, the teacher put him up to teach calculus to the other students because he knew it better than the teacher. But he had not a friend in the class or a friend in the high school. Not one. And he didn't bond even with his own family. And insofar as he ever understood what he had done that terrible night, it was just that he felt like, I don't fit, this isn't working, I've got to get out of this. And that's why he killed them. He never excused it, he never justified it, but he didn't feel very remorseful either because he didn't feel. He just didn't have feelings. And what he learned when he was on death row is, even though he didn't feel for other people the way all of us do, or the way he knew other people did, he had to find people with whom he could build a relationship. And what he did was, he built a relationship with me and my family. This little blanket that I brought here, he made for my daughter when she was just a little girl. And she used to go and see him. He used to hold her on his lap. He made this, and they used to make crafts. Now they're not allowed to make crafts on death row anymore. He made this for her. As a kind of a sign of his wanting to bond with us. One other person, just one, he bonded with, somebody who had written him a letter. Young girl, she looks like she's about 15, but in fact she was an IT professional up in Wisconsin who wrote to him, and he to her. She compiled after his death, after his execution, the letters that he wrote into a 400-page book called Knowing Andrew. And the relationship wasn't just one-sided. With me and my family, Andrew became very, very helpful. He would read articles on things we were interested in. When I was homeschooling my daughter, he helped us with homeschool plans. He wrote lesson plans for us. With Dawn, his other friend, she was doing various computer projects. He would do coding surreptitiously. He'd get on a computer, the computer that they use for the law library, and code some of her stuff that she was having trouble to figure out how to solve problems in her projects that she was doing. When he was finally executed, I stood on the Capitol steps with this blanket. And I said, look, why kill this guy? What good is this doing? And I said this. Andrew realized that while he might not feel great love, he needed great love, and he had to earn that love by reaching out to others. My family and I benefited very greatly from his resolve to do this. It makes no sense to take his life. No sense at all. It's just vengeful. The state, unfortunately, didn't listen. What can Catholics do about the death penalty? The bishops of the United States formed a group called the Catholic Mobilizing Network. You have some literature from the Catholic Mobilizing Network on your tables. The local group of the Catholic Mobilizing Network, our local group that Deacon Dick formed, is called Georgia Catholics Against the Death Penalty. We have a website, gacadp.org. We have on your tables a little sign-up sheet where you can put your name. Of course, we know your parish. Everybody here is from St. Monica's, I guess, or most everybody is. And your email address. If you print it clearly, we will send you, not often, but occasionally, notices about what is going on with the death penalty in Georgia. We encourage you to sign up on this and keep up with what's happening here, especially with efforts in the state to abolish the death penalty. We have, I think, a minute or two for questions. What about 7 or 8 minutes? Deacon Dick is available to answer questions, and we welcome them.
Thank you, Ron. How'd you like it? I want to tell you a little bit about my experience on death row. So a couple years ago, probably 3, I was sitting at Mass on death row, and there was an inmate sitting next to me. And after Mass, I looked at him and I said, "Are you Warren Hill?" He said, "Yes." And the Holy Spirit said, "Do you want to have some spiritual direction?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, I'll be willing to do that, but I can't put a whole lot of time in it. Whatever time you can give me, I'd appreciate." So I worked it out with my supervisor, Ms. Shivers, and I began spiritual directing with Warren King. On February 14th, Valentine's Day, I baptized him into the Catholic Church. He was scheduled to be executed on the 19th of that year, and the Supreme Court intervened 2 or 3 more times until he died this year at the hands of the state of Georgia. He was confirmed, received the sacrament of anointing of the sick, received the Eucharist very, very many times weekly. And I have no doubt, I heard you talking about purgatory. He's at least in purgatory. And I see him as a martyr for the faith. I have provided spiritual direction. I have been at 2 executions recently, witnessing at the request of the inmate that I be present. I'm going to tell you one real quick story. Give me a number 4. No.
Quick.
One of the guys I dealt with was a guy named Ray Brannon. He was a Vietnam veteran in the Army. He was an officer in the Army, an artillery officer, and he was a highly decorated veteran of the Vietnam War. Unfortunately, he suffered very, very significantly with post-traumatic stress syndrome. Regardless of his crime, he actually shot a police officer and killed him. He was on death row for about 15 years, and he asked me to be present. Well, I spoke with him several times beforehand, and he asked me to witness his execution. I had never done it before, and I didn't know what was it about. Well, so the first thing they asked him is, "Do you want to say a prayer?" And he said yes. So the chaplain there said a prayer. And then he said, "Do you want to say anything?" And Ray said, "Yeah, this place was lousy. I'm glad I'm leaving it." And I said, "Ray," in my mind. And then he looked out. He was on the. This is how he was. This has to create images in your head. He was laid out like this. What does that remind you of? The cross. Anyway, he said, "Do you want to say anything?" And he said, "Yeah, Dick, you're in charge." That's me. What am I in charge of? Well, throughout my relationship with him, we talked a lot about the Marines versus the Army, 6 kids versus no kid, all that good stuff. And I thought he was putting me in charge of the U.S. military. I wasn't sure. But his lawyer asked me to talk to her after the execution to see if there was any misconduct or whatever. And I said to her, "What happened?" He said, he asked me, said I was in charge. She said, "No, here's what happened. Do you remember visiting with his cousins the day of the execution?" I said, "Yeah, today." He said, "Well, you told them that you found out that his mother was in a nursing home in McDonough. And you told them that you go to this nursing home in McDonough. And you told them you would look after his mother. And his nieces told him that. So you know what I was in charge of? His mother. His mother. And I went to see her. And she's right now, this has only been a couple of months, very last stages of Alzheimer's. First time I think she knew who I was. I don't think she really knows too much more. But I took charge of his mother. These are real people. What you know about these inmates is the worst thing they've ever done in their life. You don't know all the good things that they've done, how they had these religious conversions. And don't tell me about jailhouse conversions, because they're as legitimate as RCIA. They convert because they have time to think about Jesus in their life. They sit there for 20 to 25 years studying the gospel, studying the Catholic way. And when I talk to them, I'm not talking to a monster. I'm talking to a man with human dignity. A man who deserves justice and mercy together. And what I'm asking you to do is, I don't want you to come with me. I want you to be aware of the church's teaching on this. This is not Ron and Dick talking to you. This is the church's teachings. We have given you none of our opinion today. Because our opinion really doesn't matter, does it? It doesn't matter. What matters is what Archbishop Gregory has said, what Pope Benedict has said, what Pope Francis has said, what the Catechism in 2267 says. That's what matters. And that's where you need to go. Go to the Catechism. Go to what I handed out to you. Find out about what it is we're doing in this country. Look who we're lined up with. My goodness. I don't want to be in the same sentence with those people. But we are. Particularly in Georgia. We're one of the leaders in executions. And there's a bunch scheduled. I'm telling you. May and June, we're going to be pretty active in the death penalty area here in Georgia. Unless we call upon the Holy Spirit to intervene and get a hold of your legislators and tell them this is craziness. I'm done.